Just the sound check again for you guys joining. Thank you for joining. We just admitting a lot of people into the meeting, so bear with us. We will be with you in a few minutes' time. Thank you. Alrighty. Good morning, everybody. Great spending some time with you. Thank you for joining in this great important session. We're still admitting a lot of people into the session, but let's start. Time is running out. Please keep yourselves on mute, a little bit of housekeeping, so we don't have that many background noises. But I think nowadays everybody are comfortable with the virtual meeting scenario. Ladies and gents, let me quickly share our program for today. So we're talking today and we're looking at the power of local, rebuilding rail, rebuilding South Africa. This is an event put together by the African Rail Industry Association, hosting this event in collaboration with the Transport Forum. Thank you very much, ARIA, for your kind support and many years supporting the Transport Forum as well, and the important work you are doing in this industry. Ladies and gents, we're going to quickly run through the program, and then I'm going to hand you over to our chairman to do the chairman's report. But you can see there we're going to have Anand Mudlia, the ARIA chairman, who's going to do the report and a welcome. And then we're blessed having the Honourable Minister Barbara Creasy with us to do the keynote address. Apologies for that. And then reforming the rail and port sector to unlock investments. It's Mr. Rudy Dix. It's the Head Project Management, Office of the Presidency. Then we're going to listen to Mr. Kagi Matabane, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Black Business Council, going to talk about localization and economic transformation. And then we're going to have the critical role of private finance, Mr. Ahmed Rosen, the Chairman of the Rail Working Group. And at the end, our chairperson will then do other matters and closing the event. So quite a great program. Exciting, and we're looking forward to listening to these esteemed presenters. And I now gladly hand you over to Mr. Anand Mudlia, the area chairperson, to do the welcome and the chairman's report. Thank you very much, Anand.
Thank you, Harry, and welcome to everyone online to this important session. It's been a process driven by our Justice CEO, Marcella, to create an opportunity that post the AGM of ARIA, that we have an opportunity to have a dialogue with our greater membership, as well as other industry participants, in order to all collectively put the energy behind this massive rail reform agenda that's currently underway in the South African context. So I'm thankful and grateful for all of you taking time out of your diaries to spend time with us this morning, and welcome all of you to this opportunity. Our main theme, as you've seen, is this whole concept of power of local, and we are setting the scene of that in the context of the rail reform strategic direction and journey. We are setting that scene in terms of what becomes the elements that can drive localization and industry growth initiatives. And then we're looking also as an industry, how do we grow as ARIA and play the role where we crowd in more membership, we crowd in more funding, so that we can play this catalytic role as an industry body in really bringing to fore the key things that need to be dealt with in order to push the journey of rail reform and push the journey of creating an ecosystem of logistics together. So that's my welcome. And at our AGM, I had shared an address. So I'm going to use the opportunity today to share the similar address with yourself and set the scene to where we are as an industry going to. I think welcome to Minister. I think Minister has played a catalytic role together with the various other departments within the government to really put transportation as a binding constraint, as a clear national imperative to fix. And I think what was amazing was the inaugural transport conference of last week was a great catalytic event to actually spearhead the urgencies that are necessary in driving this rail reform journey forward. What was clear there from the presidential opening remarks was there is a binding constraint in the South African economy. of transport and logistics, and that is costing the economy 1 billion rand a day in terms of inefficiencies that are in the transport system. And if we can unlock that inefficiency, if you take 1 billion a day and look at that over 300 billion a year, that represents a significant component of GDP growth that can immediately be triggered and increased, both from one being more efficient and both by taking waste out of the system. So these inefficiencies, which were highlighted by the president, were specifically highlighted on the basis that the current modal share of rail and road is inequitable, with 69% of volume still sitting on road, and that the South African logistics system, if it wants to remove this binding constraint, has to really accelerate the rail reform journey that has been tabled. Now, the rail reform journey that was eloquently shared by our minister, again, is centered around a very clear process underpinned by the two main key policy documents, one being the 2022 rail policy document, and the other one being the logistic freight strategy document. Those two documents articulate the journey that we are on, and that journey which we are on had clear objectives set by the minister, and those clear objectives that we all come to execute on is this 250 million tons worth of freight traffic growing onto the rail network into the year 29-30, ensuring that there's 600 passenger moves a year taking place on a sustainable basis, and creating this massive connectivity of where people stay and where people work, and lowering that cost of transportation that is currently costing lots of the country employees money to get to their final place of work. And rail, by its key cost-effective nature, can bring you to work at much cheaper cost. We estimate savings of up to 75% in the monthly cost of an average employee getting to work. And that means achieving the 600 million passenger moves per annum is a national imperative, both for individual growth in the economy, but also dealing with the dignity of getting to work safely and soundly on a constant basis. We also have the clear opportunity that unfolded in the maritime area is that you must increase the improved efficiencies at the port with increased crane, which is measured for the container systems in the number of crane moves that take place over the quay wall. A key strategy matrix was set there. A key matrix was set on road fatalities and how to ensure that. A key element of reducing the number of heavy trucks that should not be on road, or in terms of the modal split, is a key enabler of achieving that ingredient. And the crowding in at that stage in terms of the rail reform journey, this whole question of how do you enable the crowding in of private sector to unlock that increased investments that are needed to see an improved rolling stock onto the South African rail system. So that culminated, as we're all well aware, with the split of Transnet, or TFR rather, who was both the network operator and the rolling stock operator, into two pieces. Those two pieces now are well established as separate legal entities within the Transnet stable, one being TRIM, who's the Transnet Rail Infrastructure Manager, and the other being the incumbent TOC, which is remained with the name TFR, who's the current only train operating company on the network. And then through the process of the network statement, a process was then advertised for various applicants to look for private slots on the network. And that culminated with the minister announcing that 41 slots was allocated to private sector, with 11 new train operating companies coming into operation via conditional award to crowd in tonnage in the region between 20 to 40 million tons of volume that will come into play. Now, why is that important? That's important because Transnet has been clear through their investment programs that the trajectory of their growth, which is going to reach in 29-30 roughly 180-185 million tons, and that then leaves that 65 million tons per annum on the freight side, needs to be contributed by new train operating companies coming into the system, and the existing ones that are awarded and potentially new ones as the next round of applications come out, to crowd in the increased investment that is essential to grow the ecosystem up to this 250 million tons. Now that ecosystem, again, must be seen under the context, and I want to quote the president on the words he used at the conference, and I paraphrase from his speech: when our transport arteries are blocked or inefficient, growth stalls, costs rise, and opportunity diminishes. When they flow freely, the country thrives. Transport, as we all should know, is vital to our economy and our people. And in fact, transport is the lifeblood of a life of a nation and in all its existence. When our transport arteries are blocked or inefficient, the growth of the economy stalls, costs rise, and opportunities that our people should have all are diminished. Those were clear words of setting the problem statement and requesting a clarity of action to move forward. And the president was very clear that that action needs everyone to collectively think through that challenge and say, how do we crowd in the necessary additional rolling stock and bring them into fruition as quickly as possible so we all can be part of the solution of growing that rail volume on the rail network. The minister was very clear that ultimately we are trying to re-establish to the rail reform journey. We are trying to re-establish rail as the backbone of an integrated transport system. So that word of integration is important to understand because it talks to ultimately the competitiveness of South Africa. That in solving for transportation, you need to solve for an entire supply chain and understand that supply chain, including nodal locations, including how to now bring this cost-effective solution to the system. One key observation that we also observed as ARIA and being invited with our CEO Masela to a recent launch of the Container User Forum launch was that containers as a modal activity within the country is a large piece of the volume that's missing on rail. And that piece that's missing on rail, which should be the backbone of rail, which currently it's not, is missing because there is not clear spatial development. This was presented by Professor Jan Haverka, where he shared very clearly that these specific nodal spatial developments that need to be coordinated and set with intent, and not currently where it is not correctly set with a complete spatial plan for South Africa, is essential if you want to drive the economic and logistics efficiency of South African Inc. And that logistics efficiency is definitely going to be backed by significant volumes that should be sitting on rail from this capability of being able to build these arteries in order to deal with movement of flows between all the major provinces and coming together and leaving both import and export, but also domestic flows that move in the system. So that rail reform strategic direction clearly needs action, clearly needs constant effort to look at the different ways to speed up that reform. And amazingly, that's where localization is harnessed, because we can look into the environment of what are the capabilities within the South African localized system and what are the assets that are unused in the South African system, and crowd in opportunities to make that be a catalytic opportunity for growth and enhancement for localized activities. We see that as an opportunity for immediate quick wins based on both on localization and mobilizing more resources that can deal with the volume gap that sits on rail currently, which is largely constrained not necessarily by the network, but the initial volumes are constrained purely because there's a lack of locomotives and wagons onto the rail network. Of course, the network itself needs to be revitalized. And we are thankful and very appreciative of the leadership role taken again by our minister, and then culminated then with our budget speech from our Minister of Finance, where there has been for the first time a very clear allocation of funds that will be going in specific projects into the rail network to deal with what we call historical backlogs in terms of maintenance or modernization of the rail network. That was capable of execution because during the RFP process that Minister Creasy had put through to get input in terms of the various opportunities that private sector can contribute to also help on this journey, there was clarity that if government puts a certain volume of money into the system, customers utilizing the freight network will also crowd in funding to support that historical backdrop and then restate our infrastructure to unlock more capacity, more slots, so you can then see a growing rail network, but more importantly also deals with the efficiency of operations on a network. Because when a network is modernized, you have better frequency of trains, you have better reliability of trains running through the network, and all of that contribute to the ultimate measure of rail efficiency, which is cycle times. That ability for trains and train sets to maximize the number of trips in a particular week, ultimately then culminating into volume per particular year, and that cycle time between loading stations, en route movement through yards, movements through the mainline track, arrival again at yards that precede offloading sites, quick offloading at port logistics facilities or customer logistics facilities, and then cycling back those wagons through the network with the right type of locomotives that pull them, ultimately then will make rail be significantly efficient, that the modal share automatically happens because of cost competitiveness that rail brings to the table. That solution means that we do not leave road out of the equation, because road will always be a complementary solution to logistics and always have areas where it needs to thrive. But we all know that currently on the long arteries, the N4, the N3, the N1, there's an unfortunate too many heavy haul trucks that are trying to deal with the volumes that should be naturally on rail and should move back into a more efficient, cost-effective system where rail brings down the logistics costs, which is the national imperative that we're all seeking through rail reform, and ultimately then bring this modal shift and ultimately then make our own networks more safer, but at the same token, drive competitiveness for South African exporters and South African producers, both on the agricultural space, the manufacturing space, and the mining space. So rail reform by its nature then is extremely catalytic in order to grow our GDP as a country, and localization then becomes the key theme that enables us to now shift gear in building this ecosystem. In a declining industry, it's very hard to create any new businesses. So your industry first has to be a growing industry. And once you create a growing industry, by its key core nature of growth, other related businesses that support this growing industry then become growth in its own nature. And this is where more inclusivity comes into place. We have the Black Business Council with us here today. When we do rail reform and when we do any changes in the trajectory, we always need to crowd in more inclusivity in that process. Crowding and inclusivity is an important imperative for ensuring that the economic fruits that come through growth is shared by all our lovely citizens in this country. That inclusive growth can only be done from a growing industry. So crowding in the right environment is now the key essential ingredient to make that work. We all know that the network statement that was launched, the version that's currently in circulation, had certain key concerns in terms of bankability, specifically highlighted during the round of public sessions held by the then ARIA unit and now to be taken over by the transport regulator. Those gaps in the current legislative environment or current documentation needs then to be adjusted so that there is a clarity of how to allow the crowding in of private sector money into the space, because it has what we call bankability. Because ultimately, any project that you bring live in any ecosystem has to require the important role of funders. This is a largely capital-intensive industry, and capital by its nature requires bankable projects in order to crowd it in. So finding the right ingredients in these agreements of the Rail Access Agreement, together read with the Network Act Statement, and getting to ensure that these agreements are robust enough to meet the muster of bankability is another key enabler to achieve this growth. This growth then will drive this industry expansion, which ultimately will drive this ecosystem for potential localization. This localization agenda is not one of option, it's a one of determined choice, because it's only through growing industries that we create the ecosystem of jobs that create a competitive environment for the industries that we serve. We know in the National Rail Policy, South Africa was designated already for localization as part of the key imperative. And we know that in the African Union Statement, South Africa was already identified as being the manufacturing hub for rolling stock and other related logistics for rail components that must go into the regeneration of rail and across the entire African continent. So the opportunity for South Africa is greater than the South African rail reform. It includes creating capabilities and capacity to also drive and contribute to Africa's growth agenda, to Africa's imperatives to grow jobs by increasing the GDPs of each country. So rail reform is not then an option for any of us. It's an imperative for growth. It's an imperative that therefore that we all lean in. And as the industry body ARIA, we've set our message very clear. Localization is key. The power of localization is essential. And we can only do that with a coalition of the willing. That if we don't all lean into the challenge of seeing how to deal with the policy instruments to allow the sectors to remain competitive, but at the same time to create a localized efficiencies and capabilities that drive jobs, we do not then meet the criterion of ultimately lowering logistics costs. We can do this. The power of now is what we're after. The power of working together is what we're after. And amazingly, government has given many ingredients to help us in this journey. One such ingredient is the block exemption that currently was done by the Department of Trade and Industry under the Competition Commission. That block exemption for ports, rail, and key road corridors, which has a very key enabling capability, and I'll read it out for us so we all got them, the objectives clearly, has a very clear objectives: reducing costs, improving services, and minimizing losses caused by operational inefficiencies and infrastructure capacity shortages. Prevent, mitigate, and resolve bottlenecks and operational breakdowns in port and rail infrastructure. Contribute to measures aimed at resolving the challenges in South African ports, rail, and key road feeder corridors. Ensuring security of goods transported to South African ports, rail, and feeder corridors. So the objectives are clear. The capability for us to all work together is written in to this block exemption. We as ARIA identified that we need to be the catalytic organization to mobilize ourselves under this block exemption. And we've completed now a presentation, application made that is going into the Competition Commission to enable ARIA to be the coordinating body that when we bring various stakeholders together in the industry, be them TOCs, be them industry players solving equipment and availability and supply on the rail network in terms of the various track components, that we can come together in a safe space where we look at the objectives of the block exemption, which is all about how to use the shared network better. ARIA then will play that role of chairing those meetings, which will be documented and minuted, and then enable then that ecosystem of a coalition of the willing that I talked about to come together to say, how do we deal with those binding constraints that we know exist in this industry? And jointly then find the solving mechanisms through innovation, through collaboration, through communication, through give and take. You find common objectives and actions that can move us forward on this trajectory. So we're very proud that ARIA will be on a extreme marketing drive, trying to bring on board many of the other players that might not be members of ARIA to join ARIA, so they can have the benefit of this ecosystem and the leadership role that this ecosystem can play in dealing with these bottlenecks. One key element that was required was to map out, in the localized logic, to map out the current capabilities of our industries. Through the determined work, and she's always shared that very boldly to us, the excellent work that Marcella is doing, she managed to go and lobby for funding out of the localization fund to run a study on what is the local ecosystem for rail across all its verticals. That study enabled the appointment of a consultant to execute the work that's necessary. And Letsema, who's been given that task through a process of engagement with them through the National Localization Fund, they currently on a roadshow visiting all ecosystem players in the supply chain. What we've identified is that we need the leadership of each of these companies to present themselves in those meetings so that the mapping and the strategic vision that comes from the leaders of these organizations can be shared in that session, so that the mapping is articulate, the mapping is complete, and the mapping reflects all particular ideas across the rail ecosystem. So we urge all members of ARIA, as well as stakeholders that are on the call today, to all lean in to reach out to Marcella and her team to set up appointments with Letsema in their roadshow to have meetings to unpack capabilities, challenges, constraints, opportunities, and then to use that in order to ensure that we've got a clear mapping that is taking place. As the board of ARIA, in dealing with our objectives to grow and influence through policy and stakeholder activism, we also have identified that we needed a strategic workshop where our members come together with the board and we unpack some of the key areas that we believe that we need to put better policy discussions on, generate research papers, look at how to organize ourselves in a better way. So we are putting out to all our members and hopefully new members that will also join ARIA that within the next 6 weeks to 8 weeks, the plan is to have a facilitated workshop with members as well as the board and members, representatives, to unpack these different challenges and come up with a roadmap of what in the next 18 months we should be looking at in order to fast track the agenda for rail reform. This comes under the backbone of the minister again asking clearly for marching orders from the president last week. And the marching orders were very clear. Be faster in your execution plan. Let more volume hit the rail system. Let more passengers come onto the rail network quicker, faster, and of course, safer. We have a very good structure for safety in the rail space in South Africa with the rail safety regulator and the structured act that it works under. And we are very grateful for the leadership role that is being played by the CEO, Brian, and his team and the board in driving the safe recovery of tons and passengers onto the rail network. So safety is imperative, but working together to deal with this need for acceleration is also part of the agenda, to say how can we do that safely, but increase the speed of moving into the moving volumes and passenger volumes and freight volumes as we go forward. So we are very excited then, in closure, that as ARIA, we represent an inclusive organization. We represent an organization that wants to lead and be active in the conversation that will take rail reform forward, that we will collectively bring the skills of all our member companies into the front. We are creating verticals within the structures to allow working teams, board working teams between the different verticals, be it signaling, be it track, be it locomotives, be it wagons, so that we can get a better ecosystem of feedback from the multiple bodies and companies that play a role. And through this collective energy, through this collective coalition of the willing, we all urge everyone to lean into the challenges, to lean in for why it's imperative for South Africa Inc. and the growth imperative for our country, the jobs that are not on the game today because of a lack of efficient logistics, and then making it inclusive. That through inclusivity, it means more localization. It means bringing in and crowding new players into the system. It means making it inclusive to across the entire spectrum of South Africa Inc. and its wonderful people. And together, we know we can do it. So in those words, I welcome all of you to the session and looking forward to the deliberations from the Minister and the other participants. And again, Harry, thank you to Transport Forum for sterling work in putting these things together and allowing this conversation to move from conversation to action. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anand. Really appreciate it. And also, so great to hear the important work you guys are doing on building this ecosystem. You know, we all need to work together, as you say, and ARIA is doing the mobilization for just that. So thank you very much for this excellent presentation, introduction. So it's my honor now to introduce you to the Honourable Minister, Barbara Creecy. She's going to do the keynote address for us. Over to you, Minister. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Van Heestien, and good morning to everybody. Allow me to recognize Mr. Anand Mudlia and other members of the ARIA board and also the CEO. Let me also acknowledge my fellow panelists this morning, Mr. Rudy Dix from the Presidency, Mr. Hanki Matabani, and also Mr. Howard Rosen. And let me say that I'm really happy to be joining you at this webinar under the theme, The Power of Local, Rebuilding Rail, Rebuilding South Africa, which strongly aligns with the localization commitments outlined in the White Paper on National Rail Policy of 2022. And this theme also resonates with the work that we are doing at this juncture to reform the rail and the port sectors. Both sectors, as has been, I think, adequately explained in the introductory session, are the cornerstone of our transport ecosystem and a pillar of growth in our economy. Now, I think it's very important at the outset to explain the role of the National Rail Policy Instrument, because you may well be saying to yourselves, this policy instrument was adopted in 2022, and subsequently we are seeing a whole range of different implementation instruments, which would, of course, include the freight logistics roadmap. It would include the calls, the different calls for PSPs last year, the draft, the first iteration of the network statement, etc. And you may be saying, how do these implementation instruments carry forward, particularly Chapter 6 of the National Rail Policy, which I think embodies the important issues of localization, transformation, broad-based Black economic empowerment, and so on. And in this regard, what I want to explain is that when we develop government policy, we always start with the white paper and with the national policy document. And the reason we do that is because we know that there are going to be a whole number of implementation instruments that are going to arise, and we're going to need to measure whether those implementation instruments meet up with the enshrining policy document. So you should not expect that in each and every instrument of implementation that you would see Chapter 6 or any other chapter of the National Rail Policy repeated in that instrument, because all of those instruments are issued in terms of the National Rail Policy, and they have to implement the commitments that are made in that policy. So what is also important to say at the outset is that all government programs and government entities must comply with all government policies, even if these policies originate from other departments. Sorry, Chairperson, I'm in a place where there's a building site across the road. You will tell me if the reception is not clear.
It's clear. Thank you, Minister.
Okay, all right. No, there was just horrible noise in the background and I was worried. So transport entities are bound by policies such as the broad-based Black economic empowerment policy, the localization policy, the Steel Master Plan. Even though the DTIC is the custodian of these policies. And we believe that the process of rail and port reform are creating important opportunities to advance these policies. And because of that, we are setting up a joint implementation task team with the DTIC so that as different implementation instruments are released by ourselves, DTIC can ensure that the necessary provisions and guidelines are developed from their side. Now, the essence of what I'm saying is that economic regulation is foregrounded in the policy provisions that we are entering into. And these policy provisions are explicitly designed to enable private sector participation and third-party access in the rail sector. And we have developed our own economic regulatory capacity within the department, and this led to publishing of our first network statement as a country in 2024. Currently, work is underway to publish the second network statement of 26-27. And it's our intention that this statement will be in place for 2 financial years. And this will enable industry to have certainty and allow for the actual work of introducing new train operating companies and allow for the work of the infrastructure manager, what was referred in the previous presentation as TRIM, to unfold. Now, the network statement will give certainty regarding long-term network access to potential operators. And we want to say that we regard this as being very important because we understand that if this certainty isn't given, it's going to be difficult for many rail operators to reach financial close. It will also give guidance on the rail asset, on the development of rail asset companies, so that we have a rail asset company model where rolling stock can be financed separately from operators. Because we understand that if we are to create space for new operators, particularly where companies would be owned by young people and by women. They may not necessarily have the rolling stock. And you would know already that both PRASA and Transnet are developing ROSCOs, and the intention of that is to make rolling stock available to the broader market for the independent operators. Now, one of the questions that is very important in any rail reform process, or indeed in any reform process, is how are we embedding the changes that we see now in the long term? And how certain can you be that going forward, if there is a change of government, you would not be finding that this policy changes? And that is why we're in the process of developing the National Rail Bill, so that we will have a law to express the imperatives and the priorities of the National Rail Policy. So the National Rail Bill will support this policy by enabling institutional reforms necessary for the rail sector's transformation and overall governance. And it is our intention to take this bill to Cabinet during the current financial year of government. And once Cabinet has approved, we will then gazette for formal public consultation. And obviously, your collective inputs will be very important, so that as we shape up this bill, we can then go forward to Parliament with a bill that represents the issues that are facing the industry. Now, rebuilding our rail sector is invoking our industrial capability, strengthening logistics performance, crowding in private capital, and ensuring that localization drives inclusive transformation. The logistics system remains central to industrialization, import competitiveness, and regional integration. We can't have a situation where we take decisions to concession out certain lines, we take decisions to rebuild certain lines, and we are not supporting local industrial policy. So we have also developed the National Rail Master Plan, which is currently going through the Cabinet system. And we hope very soon we will be able to release this plan for public comment. And the purpose of this National Rail Master Plan is to guide the revitalization, expansion, and modernization of our rail system. It delineates a sustainable roadmap for rail network planning. It offers a comprehensive blueprint guiding all future rail development. And by identifying network constraints and opportunities, including necessary infrastructure enhancement and rail network expansion, the draft National Rail Master Plan aims to rebalance the road to freight logistics distribution by establishing rail as the backbone of our logistics and transport value chain. So our research indicates that the restoration of the rail system enables a modal shift of at least 60 million tons of freight from road to rail, and this would save South African businesses an estimated 26.6 billion per annum in direct logistics costs. Additional indirect savings would come from reduced congestion, reductions in accidents, emissions, noise, and policing costs. And we think these are valued at approximately 12.8 billion per annum, bringing the total potential annual economy-wide benefit of freight rebalancing to, in our estimation, nearly 40 billion per annum. On the commuter side, efficiency gains translate into lower household expenditure on transport, time savings, accident reduction, and improved accessibility for low-income communities. So in the quest to achieve the target of 600 million annual passenger journeys, PRASA is embarking on a number of initiatives to unlock the capacity of the system. And we expect that by the end of this financial year, we should be closing the financial year with an average of 100 million passenger journeys over the past year. It's important to note that PRASA comes off a very low base in this regard, and the passenger numbers have doubled over the last 2 financial years. What we have done to continue on this trajectory quickly, because Mr. Mudliar raised the issue, how do we get there quicker? We have brought in international capacity to work on initiatives to align the system requirements to deliver more passengers. The activities will include aligning infrastructure commissioning with structured timetable changes, undertaking an analysis of network capacity and bottlenecks, and reviewing the 30 km/h restriction with the railway safety regulator using operational evidence and risk assessments. Now, the National Development Plan identifies mobility as a key function that cuts across the economy, environmental sustainability, spatial transformation, global connectivity, social cohesion, and health. So to function optimally, South Africa needs reliable, economical, and smooth-flowing regional rail corridors that act as the backbone of mobility in linking large city regions. TRIM, through the implementation of the network statement and third-party access, drives the participation of new entrants in the South African rail network. And this is in line with government's transformation agenda, driven by policy and aimed at improving GDP growth and improving the underperforming logistics sector. TRIM is continuously looking at improving ways to make it easier for broad-based Black economic empowerment players to access the SA Rail network. And they provide regular engagements, including workshops to interested parties and players to guide on how to access the rail network through the various available application processes. This facilitation also includes assisting potential operating companies, both local and outside of our borders, with processes and clarification on preparedness steps so that all TOCs can put robust applications through to TRIM for slot applications. And as you know, this is a continuous process. It doesn't close. So new entrants are encouraged to consolidate volumes and apply for slots that can be allocated. And TRIM will also work with broad-based Black economic empowerment players to give access to the network through the ad hoc slot application process. This allows new entrants to apply for access as and when opportunities are identified and limits the need for an interested party to wait for the annual once-off process. Now, ladies and gentlemen, during this financial year, we issued a request for information and proposals on both the freight and passenger subsectors. And as I've already said, that 11 train operating companies from the private sector met the initial application criteria. We have since allocated 41 routes across 6 corridors. And as I said earlier, they will be able to operate for periods up to 10 years. These operators are expected to carry an additional 20 million tons of freight per annum in the 26-27 financial year. And this directly supports government's target of increasing freight moved by rail to 250 million tons per annum by 2029. I think it actually, it should be that we expect them to be carrying the 20 million tons of freight by the 27-28 financial year, because we expect these operators to be starting as from the 1st of April next year. Now, in the port's infrastructure, we've set a clear performance benchmark of achieving 30 gross crane moves per hour, a measure that speaks directly to competitiveness and efficiency in global trade. These targets are measurable and deliberate, and they signal the seriousness of our reform agenda to the market and certainty to investors. To ensure disciplined implementation of the reform program, we've also established a dedicated private sector participation unit, which is hosted by the Development Bank of South Africa on behalf of the department, and is responsible for identifying and directing the private sector participation project pipeline, developing procurement packs for state-owned entities, and monitoring implementation progress. This institutional arrangement ensures that reform is structured, sequenced, and also accountable. Allow me to indicate that our early engagement with the industry and market through the RFI process gave encouraging outcomes. The Freight, Rail and Ports RFI targeted three main corridors: the Northern Cape bulk mineral corridors, the Limpopo and Mpumalanga corridor to Richards Bay for coal and chrome, and the intermodal corridors supporting container and automotive trade. The response exceeded our expectations, and we received 162 formal submissions. I'm pleased to say that Transnet has already issued the first RFP for the bulk mineral container, for the bulk mineral terminal at Richards Bay. And later this year, we will also issue RFPs for the manganese line from the Northern Cape to Ngqura, the manganese corridor, and the general freight corridor from Gauteng to the city of eThekwini. Now, in terms of the passenger RFIs, we received 146 responses, which covered areas such as automated fare collection, modernization of PRASA depots, commercialization of the PRASA fiber optic network, rolling stock leasing, and also regional rapid rail and high-speed rail. These initiatives have created an appetite and potential opportunities for our local industry, and work is underway to conclude the assessment of the responses that we have received. I also wish to further update members and of the ARIA board and others on the webinar of the work we are doing to recover our passenger rail corridors. And to date, we have managed to recover 35 out of 40 passenger corridors. We're particularly pleased that the central line is now operating, and from the in the city of Cape Town. And we can say that from the 26th of February, that particular line has also now included the the Captain's Clip section. So we really are very we really are very pleased about that particular work. Each corridor we recover generates demand for rolling stock, signaling systems, maintenance services, depot operations, and technical expertise. And passenger rail revival is therefore not only a mobility intervention, it is also an industrial stimulus for service providers and rail industry players. The power of local means ensuring that this pipeline translates into domestic production. It means locally manufactured rolling stock, locally produced components, strengthened steel and fabrication industries, expanded maintenance capacity, and the development of new rail technologies within our borders. Our aim is to align the reforms with localization, and the rail sector must act as an enabler of reindustrialization and localization. We view the African Rail Industry Association and its members as strategic partners in the work that is underway to reform the rail and ports industry. Let me say, Chair, I was listening closely to your presentation. And I said last week when I opened the National Transport Conference that what we are trying to do is we are trying to create a situation where everybody in this massive transport ecosystem works together, sings from the same hymn book, and pulls in a common direction. And I have to say that, in fact, you didn't need me here today. You said it all, and we can see that indeed you will be our strategic partner. Your manufacturing capability, technical expertise, and financial partnerships are essential to ensuring that reform translates into growth of the rail industry and countrywide economic growth. Let us move decisively from policy to implementation, from pipeline to production, and from reform to measurable growth. Let us harness the power of local to build rail, and in doing so, to rebuild South Africa. I wish you everything of the best in this discussion, and I hope that we will continue to go from strength to strength. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. We're really looking forward to seeing this domestic production improving in South Africa and working together with DOT to make this work. Minister, would you have time to maybe take 2 questions?
Of course.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gents, you can raise your hand. Let's take 2 questions. And when recognized, you can identify yourself, unmute yourself, and ask the question to the Minister. So let's have a look at Claude. Let me just see here. Claudia, you're welcome to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you so much. I'm really involved with the Joburg to Durban rail for fresh produce, the reefer train. I've tried, and I do it for the citrus. Now, we're talking all about the operational side with regards to the trains and a lot of policy talking. I'm struggling at a point that the rate I've been given for the reefer train for this citrus season is 12% more than road. And I don't understand why, and I don't know who to contact to actually have a discussion about this.
Thank you, Claudia. Is there another question for the Minister?
Take all the questions and then I'll answer one time.
Thank you, Minister. Any other questions for the Minister? Minister, it seems they are very convinced. And compliments coming through for the Minister. I don't see any more questions.
Thank you. Look, I think what's important to understand is that the rates are now are set by the interim regulator, and that's what the network statement is all about. It's about the rates, so that we create a level playing field. I think that what we do understand is that currently, for certain commodities, it is indeed correct that rail is not cheaper than road. Maybe you will be one of the people who will welcome the increase in the price of fuel. You might be the only person in the country who welcomes that. But that situation may have an unintended consequence, that rail would in fact then become much cheaper. I suppose that the reason that we want to fix the lines and the reason we want to bring on more freight operators is because we want more competition, so that ultimately rail is more efficient and rail is cheaper. So I think we're really at the very beginning of the reform process. And we may not, at this point of the reform process, be seeing all the benefits. But
Yeah,
I think,
sorry.
yeah. So, yeah, let me leave it there. But, you know, when the network statement comes out, it comes out for public comment, and that's where you've got to get involved, because I'm not the person that sets the tariffs anymore. It's an independent process, similar to the way in which the NERSA process would operate.
Okay, thank you, Minister.
You're muted, Mr. Van Haastien.
Apologies. Let's then stick to these two questions outstanding here, Michalis and Mitchell. So let's first go to Michalis.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for that insightful presentation. Minister, could you just share with us a little bit more about the Transport Economic Regulator and the latest developments around that? And thank you very much.
Thank you, Michalis. Mitchell.
Morning, Harry. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Morning, Minister. It's Mitchell Brook from the Citrus Growers Association. Hoping you keeping well. Minister, in the interaction that I've had with you over the last few years, it's very apparent that you're very time-driven and you have targets that you like to stick to. The question I have that maybe you can answer is, do you have a timeline on when we foresee the first private operating train on the South African network? That's very, very important that we start to see the activity physically happening. Thanks, Minister.
Let me answer the easy one first. So the first private operator is due to start on the 1st of April 2027. There are already private operators operating on some of the sidings. But I think the ones you're interested in is the ones that are going to be operating on the main corridor, and that will be the 1st of April 2027. We announced them last year, and they obviously have all sorts of processes they've got to go through to raise money and rolling stock and all the rest of it. But I'm excited, and I had the privilege of meeting some of them at the transport conference, and they're very determined. Let me get to Michaelis's question on the TER. So we're far down the road. We've established the board. The appeals committee, there's a process in the National Assembly. They appoint the appeals committee. I've sent all the documentation to them, and I have emphasized that I need that appeals committee, because it's difficult to, you can't bring the body in without the appeals committee being in place. So I'm hoping that we're on recess now, but I'm hoping that in the second term of Parliament, I'm going to get that appeals committee, and I I nag the chairperson about this all the time. And then the other thing we are doing is obviously I'm not sure if the advert is out yet, but I know we've concluded the job description for the CEO. And we are also, we have existing regulatory capacity elsewhere in the transport economic system in the ports regulator. So a lot of that regulatory capacity will be shifting to the TER. So we don't have to find all of the warm bodies. I can see
Thank you, Minister.
you've got
Yeah.
more questions. If we can do 2 more.
Minister, I've been informed that we need to move on the program. Can we ask that we take people's comments in the chat room, and we will forward that to your office for comment by email. Thank you very much.
Put them in the chat. I'll answer them now before I leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. Thank you. Ladies and gents, let's give the Minister a big hand for her support and participation in this event. Thank you very much, Minister. So, ladies and gents, let's get our program up quickly. So our next presenter then is going to talk about reforming the rail and port sector to unlock investments. It is Mr. Rudy Dix. He's the head for project management from the Office of the Presidency. Thank you very much, Rudy.
Thanks, Harry, and perhaps just greetings to the Minister, Minister Creasy, the ARIA CEO, the ARIA chairperson, and colleagues that are attending the AGM. I'd ask that I have a few slides and I'll go through them very quickly, but in actual fact, probably feel the same way the Minister does, that I should close shop and go, because I think there's such a significant amount of alignment. The Minister herself has pointed out quite a bit of the areas on the reform program. I thought perhaps one of the more interesting parts would be for us to talk a little bit about what it means to unlock investment. And that would be perhaps an important area for us to discuss. So let me just quickly bring this up. Can everyone see this? And I'm going to put my camera off. That's okay, Mr. Wonderful.
We can see it, but can you? There we go. All good. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Now, I just think it's such an important part in building on the minister's comments. Let me just make this point, and I think people don't quite appreciate why the reform program ultimately, although it's coordinated from the presidency and the National Treasury, but ultimately it is the department and the minister in that department that drives us. The success of what we've done over the last 2.5 years is phenomenal. And that is partly because Minister Creasy has been emphatic about driving the reform and has been robust in wanting to ensure that the reforms do unlock and utilize the logistics system, which is always a catalyst for growth. And I must just congratulate the Minister for sticking to the reform program that she adopted, for sticking to the reform program, and where we are able to support ensuring delivery and understanding the importance of why this is for economic growth. And most certainly last week's transport conference culminated in showing and reflecting on the few years of us developing the reform program within the freight logistics as well passenger rail system. And many of you, Chair, you've made those comments, and certainly the opportunities that is there going forward. So I think it's important that Minister be congratulated once again for being the political lead on the rail and logistics reform, and from fundamentally driving the reform to its logical conclusion. Much of which would not be able to get if the Minister did not have a hands-on approach. And I just wanted to congratulate on that. If I may just, I think the colleagues here know how the reform program works. It is something that we'd introduce as part of our economic and recovery plan in 2020 as a sort of post-COVID interventions. I'm not going to talk about how it works. You've seen it. Many of you have heard us talk about it, engaged with us. Marcela has been quite vociferous in talking about the importance of the reform and the reform being a catalyst for economic growth and localization. So I'll just pass this quite quickly. Of course, in 2025, Cabinet adopted the second phase of reform. And this was quite an important part of why we are here today to be part of that conversation. Again, the same focus was a delivery-focused model that is aimed to support execution with clear political support and driven by the departments, supported through clear prioritization, rigorous monitoring, and clear reform accountability. Ultimately, it was about ensuring that the reform is about inclusive economic growth. And growth is driven largely, growth is a function of GDP, gross fixed capital formation, or simply state investment, public and private, but more so the need for us to drive private investment. It was also about repositioning state-owned enterprises, because fundamentally, as many of you have questions, if we do the reform both in energy and in the logistics sector, there are incumbents, monopoly incumbents there. The reform in opening competition, and of course having train operators or private generators in the electricity space, does impact on the ability for us to introduce great efficiency from a state-owned enterprise. And that requires significant overhaul and restructuring, including in both instances, separating operations and infrastructure, which we generally refer to as in a sense, unbundling. And these policy decisions were taken many years ago. All we're doing is implementing it. And there are complexities in all of these processes. While they both state-owned enterprises, they do play different roles in different sectors, and this is part of it in going forward. The critical thing is that we've got a balance between quick wins and the long-term reforms. And so the reforms is structural in nature. It cannot be reforms that are cyclical. So you can address, for example, load shedding, if I use that as an example, or improve operational performance, which is an important part of getting our volumes up. But structural reforms are required for us to sustain that. So you're required to change the way the sector operates. And some of that requires for us to do some fundamental changes, like unbundling, for example, the independent regulator, considering private sector participation in various parts of the sector, a clear rail policy that the minister had spoken about that is been developed, train operating companies. All these things are important because they're structural in nature. They're just not cyclical. They're not just fixing something and plastering them right now. So the reform program is an important fundamental part of structuring the economy, restructuring the economy so that we can see sustained growth. Or we continue to see cyclical growth and we do plastering, and then you see a blip in growth suddenly, and then it comes down again because we're not able to fundamentally overhaul logistics, for example, or energy going forward. I thought this slide is such an important part because it does show why reforms are important. Now, largely, colleagues and minister and chair and CEO, supply side measures are important, particularly when they constrain economic growth. And largely the reform that focuses on those constraints, we know from the models that we've run and the work that we've done, that has a potential to unlock a significant amount of growth above the baseline growth. So if you look at that graph over here, the red line, for example, shows what happens if you continue with the reform program, and you see that line, which is the scenario B, is without the reform program. So assuming we just continue the way we do, and we don't do any of the reforms, we're going to have significantly lower growth. So what is important is that we are quite, we're quite positive around an upside scenario, assuming full implementation of the reform programs, And that would say, for example, from 2028, 1.4%. Just look at 2028, you see that 1.4 on that on the red line. And the baseline of 2% in 2028. So assuming that happens, then we potentially by 2028, with the reforms fully implemented, including this reform, would see a growth of about 3%. Now that's phenomenal. And 3% growth, while it's not stellar in terms of fundamentally overhauling the way we want to see our economy, it's an important start, because at that particular level, what you do then see at 3.5% growth, you see fixed capital formation or investment as a percentage of GDP, probably between 18 and 20%. We're doing right now just under 15%. And then you see unemployment also, right, declining. That net new jobs are somewhere between 500 and 600,000, 550K jobs and 650,000 jobs. So these are important parts of how we got to sustain them. And it cannot be cyclical, and that's why the reform program is such an important. But this is quite an important part of showing with and without the reforms. Stay the course, we'll get significantly lower growth. Put the reforms in and make tough choices and trade-offs, ensuring competition and spurring investment. You see a significant upbeat in that. Now, of course, the impact of today's environment and the exogenous factors like the geopolitics and the war in the Middle East has an impact on a whole series of other indicators. But importantly is that we should not change our reform program, even if there's exogenous factors that impact on inflation. Because ultimately, I think the rest of the world, including ourselves, may go into recession. But if we can show that we can still continue to drive, because our reform is not dependent on what happens in the rest of the world. Our reform can continue because there are supply side measures that we're in control of. And I think this is an important part just to perhaps emphasize. The reforms that we're focusing on, and you see in the second phase, we are looking at creating a world-class logistics system to support export growth. And the minister, of course, is fundamentally in the driving seat to implement the reforms that Cabinet has agreed on. This just gives you a good sense of the indicators across the 7 areas. And as you can see, freight logistics at the Q3 report that we produced for Operation Vulindlela, we had shown that in actual fact, the freight logistics targets are either significantly on track or on track and maybe behind schedule. The lighter greens means on track but slightly behind schedule. The 40%, which is the dark green, shows it's on track and it's on schedule. And that's quite an important part to show that we are moving ahead, about you criticizing us that we may be behind schedule. And I think this is quite an important part of explaining this. You know what we did in our achievements for phase 1. I think it's important to remind us where we were. And Minister makes this example about being critiqued about taking slow. These things were not there. I think it's fundamental, and the decisions that we've taken was to show that we're moving in a particular direction, in a direction the policy decisions have been taken but never implemented. So we published, as Minister said, the freight logistics roadmap of the Cabinet. They considered it in January 2023. We had the first network statement ever go out for third-party access in December 2024. Private participation introduced in the container terminals for the first time. That's Durban Container Pair 2. Minister has expressed also many others that are going to go out. Economic regulator of the Transport Act passed, provide for an independent regulator and able competition. And already we're making progress to fully operationalize and implement that. And of course, private sector participation unit that has been established by the department and has set up a PSP unit that is now under DBSA. What are priorities for phase 2? And much of it has been said. It's the complete restructuring and unbundling, of course, Transnet, including creating an independent national ports authority and rail infrastructure manager. That work is ongoing, led by the minister and a technical team. Open access to the freight rail network, that has to go through, and the minister has spoken about the second draft of a network statement. It's important that we do, and it's an iterative process, so we promote and have additional train operating companies where there are additional slots that are there, so we're able to move to the minister's target that she has set, 250 million tons by 2030. We got to move towards the PSPs, since the successful RFI that was issued. How do we structure that for bankability and then go to market to ensure that we can have successful PSPs building on the existing ones that's there. Economic regulator fully established, appointment of the CEO, the executive, and everything else. And then, of course, finalize the National Rail Bill that the Minister expressed on and ensure that it creates a legal framework. The Minister has been quite emphatic about this, that she wants to see the reforms within the context of a framework that is governed by a bill. And of course will be an act. And that's quite an important part of creating policy certainty. If I draw an analogy to that, the Electricity Regulatory Act in the electricity space sets out the reform and the reform objectives in the era. It's very difficult to change. That is set out, and it says quite clearly what is done in the rail bill is to do exactly that, so that we can and able to sustain and reflect exactly the reform going forward. Now, we've done some interesting modeling, and the Stellenbosch University chaps, the BER, Bureau of Economic Research, have been doing this also independently. But we estimate that if we continue the reforms the way that we've designed it, could unlock approximately 200 billion rand in logistics system investments over the next 4 years. And that would enable GDP growth of above 3%. Now, that's quite important, because if you look at the right-hand side of the graph, check where that happens, right? And I mean, you'll see specifically the dark being rail infrastructure, because it's important that the investment in the rail infrastructure allows us to be able to open up additional slots and move greater volumes. So it has to be hand in glove. It cannot be one before the other, because I think sometimes we get into this debate, particularly as we discuss and negotiate around the network statement, risk sharing and responsibility, that we've got to work together, as the Minister says, to be able to resolve potentially the state of the network and find unique solutions around that. In the Minister of Finance's budget speech, I think a clear indication around the fiscus supporting some of that in investments, and of course the budget facility for infrastructure is an important indicator. It doesn't cover, of course, the entire cost of bringing the network up to speed, but what it does do is allocation of proportion of money that we need to think creatively of how we can use that limited resources to potentially leverage private investment or money elsewhere to be able to do that. But what's interesting, breaking it down, you can see significant portions of what we've got to do in the next 2 years is a greater spend on the state of rail infrastructure, and you see the ramping up of rolling stock over the next 5 years going forward. So this is the kind of investments that we've got to unlock, and a lot of that is not necessarily going to be done by the public sector. It's going to be done in conjunction with the private sector, and potentially where we concession. A concessionaire would have to think about how they raise money, or potentially have to think through how they will do that advancements going forward. But 2 key principles of ensuring that we are able to unlock 200 billion rand investments over the next 5 years is competition. And we've got to ensure this, because competition has to be used as a tool to improve efficiency and ensure we create a leveling playing field, both in ports and rail primarily. And that is the establishment of the Transport Economic Regulator and corporatizing as it's reflected in the National Ports Act. But we've got to be careful and ensure that the risk is managed adequately. So it's easy to announce this. It's easy to say we're going to corporatize. But there are financial risks both to Transnet, to the TNPA, and to the fiscus. And we've got to mitigate and manage those things in a manner that ensures that we mitigate, but certainly implement the policy decision that is there. The second most important part is that we've got to recognize that the private sector is going to play an important role. So traditionally, the way we would have done this is Transnet would have done all the big capex and the investments. But in essence, what we've got to think through is how we leverage the role of the private sector, particularly through potential leases or concessions. And it's important because the way we think about it is the Minister and the President has been quite clear. We're not going to dispose of assets that are core to South Africa. And the way we've got to do that is how do we leverage private sector is we remain the asset owner, but we've got to find asset managers in a way. And that's a simple way of putting out a way of trying to do a concession around this, and certainly I think some of the proposals that the minister will be working through and implementing in this year would be quite an important part going forward. The second, the third sort of element is, of course, improving the existing incumbent and the system itself. And what is quite important is that we've seen significant performance in the operational recovery of Transnet, and we've seen that significantly. So, and look at the graph. Now we're not at the level that we were in 27, 28 when we were pushing just under 230 million tons. But I think certainly the interventions through the National Logistics Crisis Committee, the improved performance management and greater support by the minister and the team has been fundamental in ensuring that we do shift those targets. I mean, we were at a low of under 150 million tons in 2023, and what we've seen is a steady 3.5 CAGR growth rate going forward. And so, getting those volumes up, ensuring that Transnet does perform as we introduce competition into the freight rail system is going to be certainly an important part. I thought it's also just critical for us to mention some of the more progress areas that is there. I mean, after a bit of a hiatus and a wobble relating to Durban Container Terminal Pier 2, finally, the chaps that had taken us to court had conceded that they had lost the court case, and certainly we moved on. That Durban Gateway Terminal became fully operational with a 49% stake and management control, and 51% stake from Transnet, fully operational from the 1st of January. Certainly, I would be excited to see in the next 6 months or in the next quarter or in the next year whether that has reaped the benefits in terms of operational performance, and we hopefully to see that. I certainly think it's going to be an important part going forward. And signing that 25-year agreement is an important part of showing that private sector participation can work. Minister had spoken about the train operating companies. I won't repeat that, and we've already seen the established PSPs and the RFIs that went out, and for us to move into the next phase of developing a bankable. It's quite important, a bankable RFP that we'll see the response from markets going forward. I certainly think that the minister's announcements and interventions on a greater role for concessions in the port space, TOCs on the rail, concessions on rail infrastructure, for example, are going to be important, dynamic, and fundamentally overhaul in this coming new financial year some of the critical stuff going forward. But I think it's important for us, just in my last slide, Chair, talk through some of the critical constraints, and we've got to work on this. And this is quite an important part, including the priorities that we set. So important to recognize, and all of you are familiar with that Transnet financial positions remain fragile, but we've got to work with that, and we've got to find a resolution on that. And this is an important and immediate task that, as we reform, we've got to also fix and ensure that we address some of the constraints that Transnet faces. Theft, vandalism, and security incidents require us to work collectively. And that's quite an important part, because we're all going to be using a common set of infrastructure that TRIM will run, or the IM will run. And therefore, collaboration between business, Transnet, the infrastructure manager, and the police is quite an important. And we know that these things can work when there's closer collaboration between business going forward. Rolling stock availability is a big issue, and I think many of the train operating companies have found very unique and different solutions. Smaller train operating companies, eventually, should they apply, I think it's important for us to find a resolution around how we make rolling stock availability, both wagons and locos. There are some creative ways of thinking through this, but certainly it needs to be prioritized. And yeah, I mean, I must say that availability of rolling stock is an important part, and how we catalyze using either upgrading or refurbishment or building here as an important driver for localization and economic growth. I was quite impressed. I mean, I know there's a lot of critique for some of the train operating companies or those that own rolling stock, particularly others that have brought it in. but they've committed usually in, for example, on massive refurbishment and maintenance of that rolling stock, replacing gearboxes, replacing bogies, replacing engine parts and a whole series of different things, and they're all doing that locally. We've got to harness the local capacity and the skills that we've built up over the last 10 years to be able to ensure that that does happen. So let's take that opportunity going forward. So although some anticipated slower pace of reforms, as you can see in the 60% that we have there, you got to understand that we're at such a critical stage that it does require for us to be able to ensure that we're at a point where a lot of the technical details require finer look at the implications, the costs, and being sure that we are not legally challenged or that it doesn't have an overburdened financial risk to the sovereign or to Transnet or to any one of the entities. And we've got to ensure that we promote competition and access at the same time. So it's a balancing task, but I think we've done pretty well moving it along. And so where there are delays, they're not delays because there's no political will. They're delays because the technical exercise requires to be somewhat detailed and important in getting it across. So what do we look at for the next quarter? And we put a couple of times here, and this is, of course, an agreement with the department, publishing the revised network statement. The minister has made that fairly clear, and updating access tariffs. We're close to finalizing that. A detailed plan for TNP corporatization. The minister's driving this with the Minister of Finance, and this will be finalized fairly soon as well. Transport Economic Regulator will be operationalized. Again, quite an important step and milestone in creating competition. And then, of course, getting out those bid windows for the RFPs in this year, with the first hopefully starting in June 2026. Thank you, sir, Chair, and thank you, CEO and Chairperson and Minister as well. But that's how the reform picture looks like, and I think quite exciting, significant potential for this sector to drive economic growth in the real sense, and a real reform and boom in the rail and port sector that we've not seen in many, many decades. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Rudy. This was a great presentation. Clearly, implementation of the priorities phase 2 in the first quarter of next year is surely going to be a very interesting time for Transport South Africa and our GDP. So thank you very much for this excellent presentation. We really appreciate that. Right, ladies and gents, let's get our program
Thank you,
up.
sir. I'm happy to take one or two comments if there are any.
Thank you very much, Rudy. So, guys, you're welcome to make comments or questions in the chat room, and Rudy will respond to that. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gents, our next presenter then, we're going to look at localization and economic transformation, Mr. Kaki Matabane. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Black Business Council, and he's going to talk to us now. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Minister of Transport, the leadership of ARIA led by the Chairperson and the CEO and other board members, members of ARIA, fellow panelists, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. Good day to all. It is both an honor for us to be here and invited by ARIA in this gathering of the AGM, and would like to congratulate you for the AGM under this powerful a theme called Power of Local, Rebuilding Rail, Rebuilding South Africa. This for us is not just an aspirational theme, it's a very, very, very urgent theme for us. And it's also a call to action. It is a recognition that the road, or rather the rail ahead, requires bold decisions, inclusive participation, and renewed commitment to economic transformation. Rail is not just a mode of transport. It is the backbone of industrialization. It is the artery through which the lifeblood of an economy flows, moving goods, connecting people, enabling trade, and unlocking opportunities. A functional, efficient, and modern rail system is essential for reducing the cost of doing business, supporting export competitiveness, enabling regional integration across the continent, driving industrial development, and creating sustainable jobs. When rail declines, economies feel it. Logistics costs rise, industries become less competitive, communities become isolated, and growth stalls. And when rails increases and improves and thrives, the opposite happens. Economies expand, industries flourish, and nations move forward. However, we must be honest with ourselves. We all know this information, that South Africa's rail sector has faced significant challenges over the past 3 decades, including infrastructure deterioration, capacity constraints, operational inefficiencies, security concerns, including vandalism and theft, and declining freight volumes and passenger reliability. And the minister spoke about the plans to improve this. These challenges have not only weakened the rail system, but have also placed immense pressure on our broader economy. And Rudy did indicate this and highlight this. But today is not about lamenting the past, it's about shaping the future. The theme that has been chosen by ARIA is very relevant. Power of local is also profound and also practical. It speaks to a fundamental truth that South Africa has the capacity, the talent, the innovation, and the entrepreneurship energy to rebuild its rail sector from within. But harnessing this power requires intentionality. To us, power of local means prioritizing local manufacturing and supply chains, thus creating jobs in South Africa, empowering Black-owned businesses to participate meaningfully in the economy, investing in local skills development and technical expertise, driving innovation through homegrown solutions, and ensuring that economic value is retained within our borders. It is about shifting from dependency to self-reliance, from exclusion to inclusion, and from stagnation to growth. The Black Business Council exists to advocate for the meaningful participation of Black business in the mainstream economy. We believe that economic transformation is not only a side agenda, it is central to South Africa's growth, stability, and sustainability. In the context of the rail sector, this means ensuring equitable access to opportunities, promoting inclusive procurement practices, supporting enterprise and supplier development, advocating for policy frameworks that enable participation, and holding stakeholders accountable for transformation commitments. But let us be very, very, very clear. There can be no true rebuilding of South Africa without economic transformation. Economic transformation is often spoken about as if it is a burden or a compliance requirement. To us as the Black Business Council, this is not true. Transformation is an economic imperative that makes an inclusive economy to be more resilient, more innovative, more competitive, and more sustainable. Well, when Black businesses participate fully, we unlock new markets, new ideas, new efficiencies, and new sources of growth. The rail sector, given its scale and strategic importance, has a unique opportunity to be a catalyst for this transformation. However, we must also confront a difficult truth. To us, as the Black Business Council, participation is not the same as inclusion. We have seen instances where Black businesses are included at the margins, women-owned businesses included at the margins, youth-owned businesses included at the margins, businesses owned by people who living with disabilities included at the margins, given limited roles in value chains, excluded from decision-making and undermined by unequal partnerships. And we say this must change, and it must change now. If we are serious about economic transformation, we must move beyond tokenism, fronting, and superficial compliance, and must focus on meaningful ownership, skills transfer, capacity building, and long-term sustainability. Rebuilding rail is not just about fixing tracks or acquiring new locomotives. It's about building a comprehensive ecosystem. And we're glad that the minister has spoken about this, and we've engaged with the minister, and we're happy that the minister is a very listening minister who also considers our inputs when we have engagements with her. The ecosystem must include local manufacturing. We must revitalize our manufacturing base, which is rolling stock, components, signaling system, and maintenance equipment. Because local production to us will create jobs, build skills, and strengthen supply chains. We must invest in technical training institutions, apprenticeships, and partnerships between industry and academia. And we must also ensure that we also embrace enterprise development. Small and medium enterprises, particularly Black-owned businesses, must be integrated in the value chains of whatever we're doing. This also requires access to funding, market access, mentorship, and support, as well as fair contracting practices. Collaboration for us is very, very, very key, because no single stakeholder can rebuild the rail sector alone. And success will require, as we all know, collaboration between government, state-owned entities, private sector players, industry associations like ARIA, organizations like us as the Black Business Council, financial institutions and labor, and communities. The role of government can never be emphasized enough, because government is a very, very critical role in ensuring that there's an enabling policy environment, there's a certainty regarding regulatory, the driving infrastructure investment, and they're enforcing transformation targets and supporting localization initiatives. The role of financial institutions is very, 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 very key, because access to funding, as you'll see when I get to the next point, is critically very, very, very important. So when we're dealing with access to funding, the financial institutions must make sure that they develop innovative funding models, de-risk investment in emerging enterprises, support infrastructure development, and partner with industry to unlock opportunities. To give an example, the minister spoke about the train operating companies. And we appreciate that there have been a lot of new entrants that have been appointed. For example, in the North Corridor, there are 6 new entrants. In the Iron Ore Corridor, there's 1 new entrant. Cape Corridor, there are 2 new entrants. Northeast Corridor, there are 6 new entrants. Central Corridor, there's 1 new entrance, and Container Corridor, there are 4 new entrances. But the challenge now, we've been engaging with most of these TOCs, and they are struggling to conclude the contracting part, because they don't have balance sheet. So there's a problem with the what you call access to funding. And then we hope, and we're working with Minister Paxton, we're hoping that the transformation fund will be finalized much quicker, so that it can help these TOCs, these new entrants, to make sure that we have competition in the train operating companies. We also need to rebuild trust And one of the most important elements in this journey is trust between government and business, large corporations and small enterprises, established players and new entrants. Without trust, collaboration fails. Without collaboration, progress stalls. We must build trust through transparency, accountability, consistency, and shared purpose. While we focus on South Africa, we must also recognize the broader African context through opportunities presented by the African Continental Free Trade Area. Rail development across the continent presents enormous opportunities through cross-border trade, regional value chains, infrastructure integration. South Africa has the potential to be a leader in this space, exporting not just goods, but expertise, technology, and services to the rest of the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, the time for discussion is important, but the time for action is now. Let us commit to the following. Put localization at the center of rail revitalization, ensure meaningful participation of Black businesses, women-owned businesses, youth-owned businesses, businesses owned by people living with disabilities. Make access to funding a priority by urgently implementing processes like the Transformation Fund and others. Invest in skills and capacity development, foster genuine partnerships across the value chain, hold ourselves accountable for transformation outcomes. Imagine a South Africa where our rail network is efficient, reliable, and globally competitive, where our industries are supported by world-class logistics, where our young people find meaningful employment in a growing sector, where our Black businesses are thriving, participating in the economy, and where our economy is inclusive, dynamic, and resilient. The future is not beyond our reach, but it will not happen by chance. It will happen through deliberate action, courageous leadership, and unwavering commitment. In closing, let me return to the theme, power of local. The power is here, the capacity is here, the talent is here, the opportunity is here. What is required now is the will to act. Let us work together, not as separate entities, but as partners in a shared mission to rebuild our rail sector, and in doing so, rebuild our nation, our economy, grow the economy, reduce unemployment, and ensure that we share the prosperity of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kanki, and thank you so much for coming to the table to rebuilding the rail sector. We really appreciate that. I see a lot of cheers coming up for you. People agreeing what you're saying. There's such an important work you guys are doing and reducing cost and doing business in South Africa and to create sustainable jobs. Such important work you guys are doing. Would you please have a look at the chat room? Should guys have questions for you that you can answer them in the chat room? You need to move on. We're a little bit behind on the program. But thank you very much, ladies and gents. Let's give him a big hand. Thank you so much. Ladies and gents, last but not definitely least, we're going to listen to Mr. Howard Rosen. He's the chairman of the Rail Working Group, and he's going to talk to us about the critical role of private finance. Thank you very much, Howard.
Good morning or good afternoon, where you are. I'm calling into you from Switzerland. Can I share my screen? I presume
Yes,
I
please.
can. Sure.
Yes, please.
Hopefully you can see my screen. Yes.
All good. Thank you,
You
Howard.
can see my screen. Very good. Thank you. Well, I've been put in this invidious position that I'm standing between you and lunch. And I know your stomachs are rumbling and you're desperate for lunch. So I will try and be as quick as possible. I want to say, firstly, it's a great privilege to be part of this event and this seminar. A great thanks to the chair, to Ms. Seller, and to my fellow speakers, and very definitely to the Honourable Minister Barbara Creasy, who I think we all agree is doing amazing. And the Rail Working Group, as you probably know, is a global group, and I meet transporters around the world. And I have to say, Minister Creasy, I'm afraid she's probably not on this call anymore, but she's way ahead of everybody else, and such a determined lady. And we match that determination, of course, but very impressive. And it's a delight to talk to her and to work with her team. I just want you to know, if you're feeling a little cool, I'm looking out of my window beyond the screen, and it's snowing. So be grateful. So let me move on. I think one of the things that I found incredibly impressive is the determination of the South African government to move forward with its rail reform program. It's going well, and I'm very pleased that part of what I'm dealing with has some influence on that, and hopefully will reinvigorate and create a much more dynamic rail network in the coming years. And I'm very pleased in a very small way to maybe be part of that. If I can move my slide on, hopefully I can. Right. One of the impressions I have, certainly coming to South Africa quite frequently, is that there is an economic turnaround going on. Now, I know we're in the middle of a difficult situation at the moment. I don't need to go into what's going on in Ukraine or the Middle East or whatever, but obviously that may well have long-term impact on many economies around the world, and South Africa won't be exempt from that. But putting that on one side at the moment, there definitely does seem to be a sense as I walk into the country and they stamp my passport again that it's changing, and it's changing for the better, and that's obviously very good news. And I think one of the most impressive aspects is that gradually the finances of the government are coming under control. The debt to GDP level is relatively high. It's close to 80%. 20 years ago, it was somewhere in the region of 25%. So it's gone up dramatically over the last 2 decades. But it now seems to be flattening off. And in fact, if you look at the figures for the last quarter, it's actually beginning to decline, which is obviously excellent news. But this comes from vigilance, from a great deal of hard work behind the scenes within government and within the business community as a whole, which is just basically making sure that the finance world is able to with my microphone, the finance world is able to compensate for the lack of finance coming in to the industry. And what it also means is that the availability of public funds is restricted. So you have, on the one side, an urgent need for investment in the rail sector, in infrastructure as well as in rolling stock, but limited funds, and a government that quite rightly is committed to tight financial controls to make sure that it doesn't slip back to the problems that it's had in the past. And we know also that investment in railway rolling stock is urgently needed. Firstly, there's not enough of it. If we're going to achieve the objectives that the industry and the government is setting for itself in South Africa and for the whole SADC region, we're going to have to put a lot more effort and money into railway rolling stock. But also, this is not a static industry. Technology is changing the industry. So it means that there's more efficient rolling stock, more environmentally sustainable rolling stock coming online. If only we can afford it, if only we've got the cash to be able to procure that equipment that we need. And of course, as technology develops also for the infrastructure, that should facilitate more frequent operations of rolling stock on existing infrastructure. that has a benefit in actually creating a more efficient use of the infrastructure. But again, to realise those efficiencies, we're going to need quite a lot of investment in rolling stock. So the only solution is for the private sector to provide the funding, because the government won't provide the funding, and in many respects shouldn't provide the funding. They don't finance every truck that runs along the road, so why should they be financing directly or indirectly every locomotive that's running along the tracks? So this is a challenge for the private sector that we have to rise to, and the beneficiaries, if we can bring the private sector funding into the system, will be not just private operators, but also state-owned operators, publicly held operators, joint ventures between the public and the private sector. They will all need new injections of capital to be able to realise the ambitions that they have. And then I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the development of the manufacturing sector in South Africa is absolutely critical. It leads to new jobs. It leads to a growth in the economy, as has been mentioned in the past during the presentations this morning. And so the expansion of manufacturing is critical. There's a lot of expertise in South Africa. I know that from my many visits, but it needs the funding. If the funding's not there, we can have the best skills in the world, but if there's nobody ready to buy the rolling stock, either in South Africa or outside of South Africa, and I'll come back to that, then of course the skill sets don't really help us. And what we know also is that in future, we're going to need the availability of private funding, both for the freight and the passenger sector. Now, at the moment, our principal focus, particularly with open access, is on the freight sector. But logically, that should change. And the way that I see this is that when you look at open access, the need for private finance is effectively the other side of the same coin, because as you open up the market, more companies come in. They're not going to be more state-owned companies. They're going to be private companies, and those private companies need cash, whether it's debt or equity. So it's going to be very critical that we can bring funding into the industry from the private sector. And it's going to be a key issue also for the operators. And they will need to be able to raise also working capital as well as simple debt. And working capital is notoriously expensive. So the more you can focus private capital on specific assets rather than just general loans, the more financially sustainable that possibility is. And I think we have to, when we look at private capital, we have to look at the various different factors that you need to take into account, differentiating between infrastructure and operations. But be careful there, because a lot of equipment that's used to build or rebuild, rehabilitate infrastructure, what we sometimes call the yellow rolling stock, this is movable equipment. So although it's part of the costings for the infrastructure. In fact, that rolling stock, oftentimes very expensive rolling stock, is actually part of the movable environment and can be financed as such. Obviously, we're going to have to differentiate between freight and passenger, particularly because at the moment, it's difficult to envisage a competitive situation on the passenger side, which changes the dynamics a little bit for the funder. Whereas on the freight side, if you've got competition, it also means that if one particular customer fails or one debtor fails, that one lessee fails, then from the funder's point of view, he's got alternatives. So that is clearly a differentiator. We also have to differentiate between locomotives and wagons. And people often say to me, well, how much is it going to cost to finance particular equipment? And there are just so many different factors involved where you can't necessarily say, well, here's the bank's cost of funds and this is the margin they're going to take and that's going to apply across the board. Are we dealing with locomotives or are we dealing with wagons? Are the wagons general wagons, which can be used in different scenarios, or specialized wagons like refrigerated wagons or tanker wagons? Is this standard equipment? that can be used in many cases, or is it highly customized for a particular customer, which means that the resale value, the residual value of the equipment is probably very small. And of course, looking at new and used equipment. And just to be clear, there's nothing stopping the existing fleets of rolling stock being refinanced with private capital. And indeed, for the state-owned enterprises, this could be a very good way of actually liberating working capital. Now, there are limitations. We have to accept that. One limitation is the gauge system. In the whole of Southern Africa, with the exception of Gautrain, we're dealing essentially with Cape gauge. Cape gauge rolling stock does exist in other parts of the world. It is used in some quite interesting parts of the world, but nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that the Southern African rail network is the most intensive Cape gauge network in the world. And what's important for a funder is that if he needs to redeploy that rolling stock for any reason, and that applies, by the way, to operators who decide they've had enough of a particular equipment or they don't need it anymore, then you've got a relatively restricted geographical spread as to where you can actually move the rolling stock. And that does obviously affect the way that you ask and you obtain private finance. Of course, there's an issue of market investor confidence. I was very pleased to hear from the Minister about how the government is looking to entrench the reform into strong legislation to give the confidence to investors who will not just be South Africans, will be foreign investors coming into the market, giving them the confidence that what they're investing in today, the scenario that they're confronting today with the risks and rewards will not be fundamentally changed in 2 years' time. We obviously need to look at the value of the collateral and obviously with used equipment, there's some equipment out there which is hardly serviceable, very old technology, very old systems where that will have a limitation in terms of providing collateral for the lender. And of course, cost of funds, which is always an issue. The banks, the leasing companies indirectly as well are affected by the way that the market provides funds into the market and the way that the regulatory system absolutely imposes obligations on the banking community to provide against particular risks in their loan book. Now, obviously, when you're looking at private finance, there are lots of alternatives there. It's not one size fits all, and it's not one type of finance. And I think that has to be clear. And I've listed on the slide the various options that you have. However, there are some movements which I think we need to focus on. There's a direction of travel which we're seeing across the rail industry worldwide, not just in Southern Africa, which is fascinating. Firstly, to what extent do you start seeing more and more wet or what we would call damp leases, where lessors are providing much more than just the physical rolling stock? Maybe they're covering the insurance, the maintenance, perhaps even the crew. There are lots of structures that you can envisage there. Secondly, operating leasing has an enormous future in the rail sector. We're seeing this happen around the world. In the aviation industry, it's one of the fundamental building blocks for the development of the aircraft sector, and we see this gradually building up in the rail sector as well. And to give you examples, in Europe, for instance, high-speed rail is pretty well advanced, but has a long way to go. Both the Swiss and the Italian operators are now looking for the next generation of high-speed rolling stock, and they're looking to take this on operating leases and not on finance leases or secured debt in any way, or even certainly not government money. And there are good reasons for that, because the rolling stock will have a particular utility for those premium operators. After maybe 20 years, they will want to move on, maybe to different technology, but that rolling stock still has a value, and they want the lessor to take that risk of the residual value and give them more flexibility as an operator. So operating leasing is fascinating, and it's got a huge potential. And of course, it's also very helpful for new entrants into the market, just as in the aviation industry, where they don't have a lot of capital, they don't have a track record, sorry for the pun, but they are able to go and raise funding through operating leases, where the lender is looking just at the value of the collateral. And that opens the way for Black empowerment businesses, for women businesses. I heard this loud and clear from previous speakers. Operating leasing is the key to that, because then they can move into that market and compete with highly capitalized companies. So all of that said, the money is there. And that's the most important thing. The money providing capital into the rail sector is there. It's coming in from the banks, the financial institutions, insurance companies, pension funds, private equity investors, securitized funds, the leasing industry. The money is there. It's just a question of how do we tap into that resource and to make it much easier to obtain the money and to obtain it on a sustainable level. Now, many of you will know about the Luxembourg Rail Protocol. I hope you do. And I don't want to give you an entire lecture on the Luxembourg Protocol, although of course I could. But as you can see from the slide, the Luxembourg Rail Protocol, which has been ratified by South Africa already, brings some really significant benefits for the private finance sector. And in so doing, that should open up the possibility also for cheaper, more accessible funding, whoever to come into the market, whoever the operator is. And that creates a fundamental shift in the economics of the industry. So it's great that Luxembourg has been ratified by South Africa. It's not yet in force in domestic law, and we're working very closely with the Department of Transport to pilot that domestication through the system. It will take a little while, but hopefully not very long. And we would like and hope that when Minister Creasy says that the first TOCs will start operating on the 1st of April next year, we would hope that the protocol is in force as a matter of South African law at that stage, giving those TOCs the best possible opportunity with the best possible funding to make this whole project a success. As I mentioned before, key is to lower the barriers to entry into the market. That's what the Luxembourg Protocol does, and it creates a degree of operational transparency. And I've analysed there also the various benefits that it brings to the market. But I do want to focus on export credit support, which is potentially enormously important for South Africa. As was noted earlier in the morning, the African Union has designated South Africa as the manufacturing hub for Africa for railway rolling stock. That's terrific. The difficulty is that there are lots of customers out there outside of South Africa who would like to buy rolling stock from South Africa, but they don't have the money. So to the extent that when they ratify, those countries ratify the Luxembourg Protocol, that makes it easier for the private sector to come in and provide the funding for the rail industry outside of South Africa. That's obviously a big plus, and that will help the manufacturing sector in South Africa, not just to find new orders, and whether it's Cape gauge or meter gauge, which is very similar, maybe one day soon, standard gauge, the opportunities are out there, and that in itself is a big plus. But also, let's not lose sight of the economies of scale. If you have a higher production line, if you're producing more of the same equipment, the Chinese are the best example of that, then your unit costs go down significantly. You're tooling up for a much bigger production. So you spread those costs over a much greater production. And that has a huge benefit for the industry. And it means, again, that you create a level of financial sustainability that's important. And we're very pleased and very gratified and grateful for the support from ECIC, who have said absolutely clearly that if the Luxembourg Protocol applies in countries where there are exports from South Africa, they will reduce their risk premiums by up to 20% in relation to supported debt. That makes an enormous difference. I can go into lots of detail and we don't have time, but it's clearly going to be a major stimulus to bringing more business into South Africa, procuring rolling stock, which can then be purchased and operated outside of South Africa, but within the African continent. And then also important, people mentioned this morning already, Roscoe's, how Roscoe's are going to have an important role to play going forward. There will be state Roscoe's, there will be joint venture Roscoe's between state and private operators, there'll be private Roscoe's. But these entities will be raising money in their own right, going out into the market, aggregating risk between the different operators, between the different routes, different types of equipment, and they will perform a very important role. And South African Roscoe's will have the benefit of the Luxembourg Rail Protocol, both in terms of the leases that they are then using to provide the rolling stock into the market, and on the other hand, in terms of their debt financing, when they're raising secured debt to finance their operations. So in both cases, they will have the benefit of the treaty, and that can only be an excellent thing. So the question is, what does government do, and how does it help? Well, the government can do a lot to facilitate, and I think we see this actually with Minister Creasy. The government can do an enormous amount to facilitate without necessarily putting its hand in its pocket. But there are specific roles that have to be played by government. Clearly, they have to be the driver towards rehabilitating the infrastructure. They have a role in regulating the access, whether it's directly through government or through an agency that is performing this role. You obviously have to have fair access when you have more than one operator looking to use the same infrastructure. There will be a growing need to regulate admission of rolling stock into the system, and this is important for creditors as well. You don't want, as a lessor, to be owning rolling stock that's not fit for purpose, that cannot operate on the rail system effectively or efficiently. So that whole regulatory environment has quite a long way to go. And we know that there's a possibility, for example, of a national vehicle register. I spent some time last week when I was in Johannesburg with RSR. I think there's going to be a much more dynamic approach from government there to make sure that the rolling stock is safe when it's on the system and it's fit for purpose. And obviously providing legislative security. We talked a little bit about embedding reforms into the railways legislation. That includes the Luxembourg Rail Protocol, of course, and we're hoping that they will be able to take that forward as quickly as possible to create the conditions where the private sector can just come in and literally deliver the goods. Two other areas that I think are very important in terms of government facilitation. One is the banking authorities. Now, you may know this, you may not, but banks have to adopt a risk weighting system when they look at their loan books. The higher the risk, the more capital they have to allocate against those risks. And once upon a time, that was the decision of the banks. For some years, that's not been the case. There were instruments called Basel III, and soon we'll have something called Basel IV. These are not different cities. It's the set of regulations that has been agreed by the Bank for International Settlements, which is based in Basel, which sets out the prudential requirements for banks to allocate capital against their loan books. So the bigger the risk, the more capital they have to allocate. That capital costs them money. Their cost of funds goes up, which means that it's going to be more expensive to lend into the market. So we have a real interest in trying to push that risk down and push the cost of capital down. But of course, we need the regulator to cooperate as well, because he will be supervising how the banks actually allocate their capital. And our argument, our very strong argument, is that when you have instruments like the Luxembourg Protocol, which reduce risk, then the risk weighting for the banks should also go down, and therefore the amount of capital that they allocate should go down, and therefore the cost of funds should go down, which makes it a cheaper offering into the market. And lastly, we can't ignore the regional aspects of the rail system, because you've got rolling stock that potentially can move across all the SADC states. And that represents its own risk to financiers. And we impress on governments, not just the South African government, the need to move forward as quickly as possible so that it's not just South Africa that's adopted the treaty, but also many other countries around South Africa, so that we can see in the future seamless operation of financed equipment where the financier doesn't care where the rolling stock is, he's secure regardless. How the industry should react to facilitate the finance is also very important. Obviously, ARIA, other industry organisations, the Rail Working Group, we all have a role in pressing governments to move forward, providing the necessary legislative framework so that the private sector can get on with the job, can provide the funding in the most efficient way. But we should carry out that role. It's no good sitting back and just thinking, well, something will come along sooner or later. We're in a highly competitive environment. The road and the aviation industry, for that matter, are strong competitors, well-financed, with a strong lobbying capability. And so we must also put our case and make sure that governments respect that case, where essentially we have their sympathy. It's just a question of pushing this up the priority list to make sure that the legislation does go through quickly, rather than gets stuck on an outgoing tray somewhere, but doesn't happen for the next 2 or 3 years. So our involvement and our engagement with government as an industry is absolutely critical. I think we also have to play a role in selling private finance to the investor community. It's all very well going to the big banks, for example, all of the big 5 banks here in where you are in South Africa are members of the Rail Working Group. And most of them understand very well the rail sector, but they may be sourcing funding from other sources. They may be securitizing funding. There's an investor community out there beyond the banks, and we have to be able to convince that investor community that this is a good asset class to invest in, as indeed it is. If you're a pension fund manager, what could be a better investment than long-term assets like rolling stock, which are used on a continuing basis? And as long as they're properly maintained, their rights are protected, then this is an excellent investment. And when you see a lot of, let's say, risky investments that pension funds and institutions go into, this is not one of them. But we have to get that message across. And then another factor that we have to take into account is that under the Luxembourg Protocol, we create for the first time a global unique vehicle identification system. And that's incredibly important. It means that it's not just the facilitation of registration of international interests against that rolling stock at the international registry. For the first time, we as an industry have a way of identifying uniquely and unequivocally rolling stock, which is being financed, which has a big advantage, not just in terms of finance, but also in terms of maintenance. You can keep a lifetime logbook if you always identify the rolling stock in the same way. The tracking of rolling stock, particularly if you've got GPS type tracking of rolling stock in real time, that has to be by reference to a particular identification system. If there is a national vehicle registry in South Africa, and I would hope that there would be, then the system's there already. You don't need to reinvent it. The numbers are easily available from the international registry in Luxembourg. They cost peanuts. And so essentially, we should get on as an industry already marking the numbers now onto the rolling stock, taking into account the UN model rules, which set out particular regulations as to how the minimum rules as to how the rolling stock should be marked, and it's very simplest. It's a 15 by 10 plate with the Orvis number on it, but of course people can do much more than that. So again, I'm conscious of the fact that it's lunchtime. But I hope I haven't given you indigestion before lunch. To summarise, obviously, we urgently need investment in rolling stock in South Africa and outside of South Africa, in Africa. There is an enormous potential out there, if only we can recognise it. And that's going to need money, and it's not going to come from the public sector. Some money may well, yes, come from aid agencies or whatever, but it comes with strings. The private sector is the real source of funding going forward. And we've got to be able to attract that money, We've got to make it the best possible investment for investors because they have options. We have to recognise there are limitations, but there are some amazing possibilities out there, and we should look to use those possibilities as much as possible. And the key to that, the government role here is not to provide the funding for the rolling stock. They don't need to. The key is to provide that legislative framework, whether it's domesticating the Luxembourg Rail Protocol, whether it's the National Rail Bill that's now being formulated. They need to provide that legislative grounding and then let the industry get on with it. We can do it. But also we have to play our part, making sure the government knows why we need this, why it's important, and if there are people, let's say from other sectors of the transportation industry who try and block it, we have to overcome that, because at the end of the day, railways are the most efficient, environmentally sustainable way of moving goods and people around the continent. And this is the future for Africa. Railways are part of the AfCFTA. Without railways, you won't be able to shift the goods in volume. And they're also part of the economic development and regional integration of Africa. So if we get it right, and we do it quickly, let's not hang around. The opportunities are amazing for the rail sector and for South Africa in particular. It will help support industry in South Africa, the manufacturing capability, the expertise, the financing institutions who develop and expand their activities across Africa. And last but definitely not least, the operators and the public, who should also be great beneficiaries of the way that the private sector can come in and play its role as a key financier for the rail industry for the decades ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Howard. There's no indigestion this side, definitely, especially when you said also we need to get focused on what we are doing. Surely we're going to press government for this. Fortunately, we've got a good minister, and I really hope that she stays in her seat for many years to come. Howard, thank you so much. The Luxembourg is such exciting news and exciting protocol, and I think we need to make effort to implement this and to make it work in South Africa for the benefit of all of us. So thank you very much for the excellent presentation. We really appreciate that.
Pleasure. Pleasure.
Thank you. There might be some questions in the chat room. If you can have a look there, maybe you can answer some of the questions. Thank you, Howard. So, ladies and gents, we're drawing to a close here. So what I would like to do now is I would like to hand you over to our chairperson, Mr. Anand Mudlia, so ARIA chairperson, and he can do other matters and close the session for us. Thank you very much, Anand.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you all to the wonderful participants as well as the various presenters, and especially to our minister. She always comes across with great energy and great focus that allows us all to harness our own energy as we move forward on this beautiful journey. So I think, not to belabor the meeting, I think it's been an awesome event where we've had clear articulated messages on where we are in the rail reform journey. Rudy Dick shared very eloquently the challenges and opportunities that we can go forward. We know it has to remain an inclusive journey, and I think thank you very much, Mr. Matbet, for your contribution. I think the call to action for inclusivity is definitely something that sits as a cornerstone, as shared with the minister, entrenched in the policy. And I think the question and the messaging from Mr. Rosen, who has been an architect of keep sharing a very clear message that we don't mobilize this as an asset class, you don't necessarily unlock the investments that you need for it. So rolling stock as an asset class with clear identification, clear capability for being monetized as collateral for the fundraising you need to make for asset investments, further entrenches the architecture that is necessary for rail reform. So with those closing remarks, again, thank you to yourself, Harry. Thank you to my CEO, Marcella, for her leadership role that she plays. Thank you to my board for all the effort that's been done. And more importantly, we welcome membership to ARIA. We believe that we're on a journey of inclusivity, and if the collective wisdom can be brought together with this coalition of the willing, where we all come together, we all use the platforms that we created to create the right articulation of where the challenges are and the right articulation where the urgency and efforts can come, we do believe that we can move this needle in a significant manner. So thank you everyone for being on this journey with all of us. and God